All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the first CHASES lecture of the year. CHASES is the Center for the History of Agriculture, Science, and the Environment in the South. I'm right now serving as its director. My name is Mark Hersey. It gives me great pleasure today to welcome Sterling Evans, who holds the Louise Welsh Chair in History. I went in the History Department at the University of Oklahoma. Sterling, like me, was trained at Lawrence, Kansas. He's a fellow Jayhawk. He earned his PhD in Latin American environmental history, which is an interest he's maintained over the years. It's evident, in fact, in his two monographs, both of which are influential. The first one is Green Republic, A Conservation History of Costa Rica, and then more recently, Bound in Twine, The History and Ecology of the Henneken Wheat Complex in Mexico and the American and Canadian Plains. Bound in Twine won the Agricultural History Society's Saludos Best Book Prize, as well as the Carolyn Bancroft Award, which is the Denver Library. And it placed him as one of the foremost historians in the studying the American West borderlands. Indeed, he now edits a book series on that very subject from Texas A&M Press. I could go on. He's edited a number of important collections. Most recently, the volume that appears in the flyer for this event today, make sure I get this title right, which is Farming Across Borders, A Transnational History of the North American West. And he's one of the leading agricultural historians in the world. In fact, he's currently serving as the president of the Agricultural History Society. So he's here today to give us sort of a taste, like a first run for what will become his presidential address later this year to the Agricultural History Society, and it's provocatively titled The Age of Agricultural Ignorance, Trends and Concerns for Agriculture Knee-Deep into the 21st Century. Please join me in welcoming Sterling.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be back here in Starkville, Mississippi, here at MSU. I was here for this very Chase presentation about 4, 5, 6 years ago, whenever it was. It was my first time then to MSU, and I really like this place. I like this campus. Obviously, you've chosen a great place for your studies here. Those of you who are students, those of you who are professors and faculty here, it's a great place to be, and I'm proud to be back here and visit with you about this. It is my presidential year for the Agricultural History Society. We're meeting here this weekend as an officers' mid-year meeting, so we have that meeting this morning. Our program committee, which just walked in and must have just done successful work getting our program ready, also professors from around the country in ag history, have been meeting, and so we will be having our annual conference in St. Petersburg at the end of May. One of the things I thought we should talk about, though, today and then is how we are living in the age of agricultural ignorance. That's not my term. In fact, most recently it's been brought up by many people too, but most recently by this gentleman. Maybe you've heard of Baxter Black, the cowboy poet, the philosopher who's also a veterinarian and a rancher down in West Texas and things. And he talked about this because he heard about it in another journal, actually the Delmarva Farmer Journal. The editor there called this that we are living in the age of agricultural ignorance, in which this is an age where there's an expanding ignorance, that there are many reasons for them leaving the farm and how people don't have the same kind of background that they did years ago. In fact, look at this for an example of people who were the population engaged in agriculture in 1933, 25%, and now 2%. It's an amazing kind of statistic when you think about it, and just let it kind of sink in for a minute. And there's, of course, lots of reasons for that. People wanting to leave the rural areas of the United States, rural flight, all kinds of other things too, the takeover of corporate agriculture, which I'll be talking about a little bit later today too, and all kinds of things like that too. But Baxter Black also talks about it, how it's also because there's less science. We're not emphasizing science enough in the United States, even though you think that we probably would be. But this age of agricultural ignorance is also the age of expanding ignorance of science, in which only 50% of all postgraduate degrees are science-based, and curriculums are even fewer. He brings this up, I think, in many ways to talk about, because we're more of an urbanized society now, of course. He talks about how it's still very important to him to do calving. And they're done with calving now on his ranch and things earlier out there perhaps. But he talks about how that's an incredible experience to have calves. And I'm not sure how many of you in this room have had that experience. But more and more that experience is not really relevant to most students today. As urbanization inexorably isolates people from the land, fewer and fewer humans are able to participate in this ancient experience. And far less it will be in the future. And so this is interesting because not only is it that way, but there's still kind of a way that despite that only 2% of people are engaged in agriculture, we are still feeding 320 million people daily and furnishing about $45 billion worth of food exports abroad. So we're not a country going hungry. We're still having a lot of excess production naturally. But so what's going on here is one of the things I'm going to like to talk about today. And yet, it is ignored by mainstream politics and the media in a very big way. I will quote here from Jim Hightower, the former Texas Commissioner of Agriculture, who writes, "Remember last year's presidential debates?" And think about those, okay, if anybody would like to. Trump and Clinton talked about the needs of hard-hitting working-class families, veterans, coal miners, and others. But hello, where were farmers? Indeed, where were the multitude of producers, farm workers, ranchers, ranch hands, fishing crews, seafood workers, etc., who toil on the lands and waters of this country to bring food and water to our tables? All went unmentioned, even though economic and emotional depression is spreading through their communities. Farm income has declined steadily, plummeting 12% in the last year alone. But poof, these critical but endangered food producers were totally disappeared from the political cognoscenti. Actually, the farmer has long been forgotten in America's presidential discussion. In a New York Times op-ed, Professor A. Hope Jahren reported on the astonishing discovery that she made when reading through the transcripts of past debates. Farm policy hasn't come up even once in a presidential debate for the past 16 years. Let's go down memory lane. Remember the Bush-Kerry debates, Obama-McCain, Obama-Romney, and now Trump-Clinton. Not a single one of those mentioned them, and even on high-profile TV debates, nothing was mentioned about farming or agriculture. So it's an interesting time indeed. And I think that's also hit academia in a big way. As my colleague Sarah Gregg has written from University of Kansas, the central place of agriculture in American development is indisputable. But many historians have ignored the natural and economic impacts of agriculture in their analysis of the modern nation. And so that is incredibly true. We have forgotten about some of the farmers, and others have written about that too. Going back, Jeremy Vetter, who's on our executive board for the Agri-History Association, has written that early expeditions into the American West, famed naturalists relied on farmers and agriculturalists to know because they knew the land and knew how the species lived with those lands, and how very much early 20th century knowledge about the land in the West came from farmers. But this perhaps is not new at all. In the 19th century, famed entomologist and philosopher J.H. Favre wrote, "History celebrates the battlefields whereon we meet our death, but scorns to speak of the plowed fields whereby we thrive. It knows the names of the king's bastards, but cannot tell us the origin of wheat." And this is the way of human folly. We do need to know more about those backgrounds. None of this is new to some of those ancient philosophers from another time period. Notice what Leon Tolstoy wrote about in Russia on the importance of agriculture. City residents, for the most part, consider field work to be below them. Nevertheless, the great majority of the people in the world are farmers, and it is they who assure the existence of the rest of the people. In reality, the human species is almost entirely composed of farmers. Therefore, being the most moral, healthful, happy, and necessary of occupations, farming is also the most noble of professions, and the only one in reality that provides the independence of those who forget that. And that's important to keep in mind, of course. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson and his ideals for an agrarian republic and the Empire of Liberty based that on an agrarian ideal. Later on in the 19th century, people like Karl Marx and John Locke used that whole concept too of how the earth's magnitude, the wealth of the earth could only be exposed, it could only be unlocked through labor and the labor of farmers, and as part of their advancement of that kind of understanding. So this is nothing maybe new in what we're thinking about. And yet today, we live in this era of agricultural ignorance. The Agriculture History Society has been working to change that. And in its early days, there was so much information about ag tech. We can think about some of those ag tech and ag economics that put most people to sleep and help maybe kind of kill off our discipline maybe for a while there until it was resurrected in the last 20 years. Then we started talking more about ag labor, and rural life became an important facet of what we do as agriculture and rural historians. And I'm glad we've moved in those directions in a big way. Later, we talked more about race and class and gender, as well as we should have, since the 1970s when social history was informing our field as it was so many other fields too. And most recently, we've gotten into the connections with the environment, with our cousins in environmental history, and more recently yet, transnational connections, something that is one of my areas that I like to talk about the most. In fact, the theme for our conference program in May is Tropicana, commodities across borders. And I think that's important because a lot of us do study those kind of things about commodities across borders. The book that Jim just mentioned, or that Mark just mentioned here about farming across borders, looks at this very issue between farmers and farming and agriculture between America and Mexico and the US-Canadian borderlands in kind of a more regional setting in those ways. Others are doing that connect this region, the American South, and I want to talk a little bit about that today since this is the region that we're in today. Tori Olson's book, Agrarian Crossings, Reformers and the Remaking of the U.S. and Mexican Countryside, actually really goes out on a limb to suggest how reformers during the New Deal went to Mexico to look at ways that they could improve from their ideas of land reform and agrarian reform to help the American South coming back north to this area. It's going to be a prize-winning book in many fields, and I would encourage you to look at it. Going the other way, Eve Buckley's book, Technocrats and the Politics of Drought and Development in 20th Century Brazil, looks at how TVA officials from the United States and during the New Deal went down to Brazil to help inform their policies on water development, especially in the drought-ridden Brazilian Northeast. It's an amazing book of rural and ag and environmental and policy history in many ways. Also, Tom Oakey, who's a part of our organization's book, The Georgia Peach, Culture, Agriculture, and Environment in the American South, and probably should win book prizes just by the cover alone. I'm always glad when publishers actually have a book that makes you want to buy a book, and you should want to buy this book. Tom asks in the very first sentence of the book and the very last sentence of the book, would you care for a Georgia peach? And around that model, he frames the whole idea of agriculture, peach horticulture, pomology, evolutionary biology, and the whole rural life and the whole question of identity in Georgia around the peach, which is very curious because, as he points out, peach is the only number 3 crop in Georgia. It's not the number 1 crop. Georgia is the number 3 peach producing state after California and South Carolina. But yet there's this idea of identity, license plates, everything in Atlanta, and Peachtree this, Peach County, Georgia. All those kind of things make it a very important book and in many important ways. And he talks about that. But he also connects it to a broader transnational region because peaches were developed first in China, then later Persia, and then were developed horticulturally in Belgium. And all these things came together in the heart of the Deep South, down in that peach country of Georgia. So it's not just about the Georgia peach. We need to keep those things in mind. Other recent books that have also connected this region abroad are Andrew Zimmerman's Alabama in Africa, Booker T. Washington, The German Empire of Globalization of the New South, about all kinds of things that went from here to Africa and back. In the Shadow of Slavery by Judith Carney and others. Africa's Botanical Legacy in the Atlantic World talks about all kinds of plants that were brought from Africa to the South to sustain slavery, connections that were so important during that time period, as well as her book, Black Rice, the African origins of rice cultivation in the Americas. But rice cultivation, of course, was for slavery to mainly produce in this region cotton. And so we could look at Jim's book on boll weevil blues, then Geeson's book on the cotton myth and power of the American South, which also has a connection showing how the boll weevil, originally from Mexico, came and then was conquered in parts of this American South. I want to talk about cotton, okay? Because that's where we are. We're in cotton country. I live in cotton country in central Oklahoma. I think Oklahoma is often, for a while, it was the third largest cotton producing state. It certainly doesn't have that role now, but for a while it did and is a huge cotton developer. I'm originally from the northern Great Plains, North Dakota, so it's kind of outside my area, but my dad and I have kind of recently got interested in how cotton is produced since we're not from that kind of area. But the big pickers you see here with the bales, and of course the pickers and the, oh boy, the other one is the pickers and the, Jim, help me out here. The other one, the kind of harvesting machine, are the strippers, right? The pickers and the strippers with the big modules of cotton there. And of course, around other places across the country, this is familiar grounds. How is the cotton production this year in Mississippi? How many know? My students in Oklahoma wouldn't be able to answer that either, since most of them are from Oklahoma City, Tulsa, and Dallas. Not too many people would probably know, and yet we're surrounded by cotton fields all across Norman, Oklahoma. But it's interesting to think about this being a picker compared to what picking was, and how even in our generation, there are still people with the memory of the other kind of cotton picking. My wife works in hospice and often deals with people who grew up in rural Oklahoma, many of whom never had an education, ever, not even elementary, because their folks had to have them help pick cotton. And when the cotton was done in Oklahoma, they went to Texas, then to Arizona. They would all their lives just picking cotton. And that's an interesting memory to have. And we've lived through some of this, they have lived through this transition from that kind of cotton picker to this kind of cotton picker, all in this one kind of lifetime that we need to have a memory of, and it's so important to have. From back in the time period of the first map here, when in the 1860s, the American South was producing 70% of the world's cotton, and how that cotton frontier has moved further west to the dark areas you see on the map, especially now, West Texas, okay, down in the Llano Estacado by Lubbock is now America's #1 cotton producing region. Arizona and California are high up there too, parts of Oklahoma. Obviously the deep south too, including the delta of Mississippi, is still one of the most regions. But how that transition happens, that frontier of cotton development, is an important part of what we should know about that agricultural commodity. And I want to connect it to where I live in Oklahoma, because cotton is the reason that Oklahoma exists. And I'm not because it was produced there, but because it was originally Indian territory. From 1834 to 1907, this was Indian territory, the nations, as sometimes it was called, right? And those nations were the 5 tribes that were removed from the southeast. And we need to have that discussion. Most of my students in Oklahoma don't know that we exist because of cotton. Because during this time period of the early 1800s, the early 19th century, the prices of cotton doubled up to 30 cents a pound by 1815. Imagine something doubling in worth in a very short period of time at the time period when America's agricultural boundaries were growing. That prompted hundreds of thousands of Americans to race to the deep south to grow cotton. And U.S. cotton production increased tenfold in one decade, from 1810 to 1820. And then the U.S. South surpassed India as the world's leading cotton producer by 1820. All of that led to an apex of interstate slave trade in the South and led to Anglos pushing out Indians in the region. Because, obviously, as we get the technology with the cotton gin, and as we were producing more cotton by that time, and of course the gins that look like this today, the big Lummus gins that are in the gins of today's cotton business, was led because of the industrial textile boom in England. So talk about the transnational connection once again and how that affects this region of cotton production in my state of Oklahoma, and you start seeing why commodity production is so transnational. All of this was made possible because of the development of finance, with most British capital flowing into the American South. And then when President Jackson liberalized trade policies are nothing new. Things like NAFTA and those kind of trade policies go way back if it's in America's best interest. He liberalized those trade policies, making cotton cheaper to transport and sell to the United Kingdom. which just prompted more and more people to get into cotton production. And this became this kind of global pattern. We always think of this for rum and sugar, but notice the same kind of patterns exist for slavery and cotton, with manufactured goods and other products flowing across the Atlantic in these various transnational ways that commodity flows and commodity chains always reveal. Wow, the big cotton barges flowing down the Mississippi, taking those to port, and all kinds of labor involved with cotton production in terms of an incredible world economic powerhouse through the days of textiles with the need of cotton in places like India and the American South, all developed around this commodity. Meanwhile, the number of banks in the United States doubled between 1827 and 37 from 333 to 729. Seems like such a low number, doesn't it? But think about that, doubling in that time period. Cotton, sugar, and slave industries all benefited from this expansion of credit. All these banks are now giving credit, which means you can buy more slaves, you can put more cotton into production, and all that made land seizures and removal of Indians in the Southeast, especially with the liberalized speculating and slave trading, highly profitable. What are you going to do? You're going to move to the South and grow cotton because it's that profitable. Now, with the Indians removed, black slaves were forced into the Southeast United States, especially to clear land and build these plantations. Then in Alabama, the Creek War, the Red Stick War, the Creek Civil War also led to more indication that the United States should do something about this Indian problem. And that gave the U.S. government more pretext to move Indians out of the region, the Red Stick War. So in his message to Congress in 1830, entitled On Indian Removal, President Jackson set out this policy to remove the Indians. Actually, and he said it in his own words, for their own good. He was trying to be humanitarian. If not, they're going to get killed by all these incoming Anglos coming down because that price of cotton is going to be so profitable to grow. And hence, Indian removal, okay? The 5 tribes that came out. And we're sitting in that area today, are we not here? We know the Choctaw country here in Oktibbeha County, right? A great Choctaw word right in the center of Choctaw country, are we not? And so at that point also then, we should think about this idea of how that led to the development of the state I'm in, including how Congress appropriated $500,000 for the removal of Indians. About 5% of the military budget that year was for Indian removal. But expenses grew so rapidly with Choctaw lands that the government collected $8 million just from Choctaw lands here in central Mississippi alone. So it kind of paid for part of the removal after time. And that opened all these lands up to private acquisition with speculators buying up most of the land. And Indian country came to look like this, okay? With the Creeks and Seminoles in the middle, the Cherokees up in the northeast, and the Choctaws and Chickasaws down in the south. Of course, then other Indians. You got to remember, other Indians were already there. The Osage, the Wichita, the Caddo, the Kiowa and the Apaches, the Comanches out in the west. What about them? And all of a sudden, the 5 removed tribes just kind of get overlapped onto land that they considered sovereign. It was not a great situation in many ways at all. Which then, of course, led to the time of the Civil War, when Oklahoma, people in Indian Territory, joined the South, joined the Confederacy. Why? Because the Confederacy at least promised them a voice in Richmond. The Confederacy was not the group that removed them away from the South. It was the Yankee North. Okay? So they're not going to side with Lincoln. Why would they? There was no reason for the 5 tribes to side with the North. And so it made for interesting times in where I live today. And they became agriculturists. Notice the seal for the state, Muskogee Nation or the Creek Nation, right? A walking plow. Because with them they brought their slaves. Obviously many of these Indian peoples were slave owners themselves, brought slaves with them. Another reason for them to side with the Confederacy in Oklahoma, side with the South. Of course, the Osage shield is our symbol today in Oklahoma, but nonetheless. All of this was because of King Cotton. That kind of impact then shows the transnational as well as local and transregional connections because of King Cotton at the time. Historians of the Caribbean will talk about King Sugar, and of Eastern Brazil, King Sugar. I've talked about King Henneken before in the book that Mark mentioned, the Henneken wheat connection with the Great Plains in this book Bound in Twine, that connects how Henneken, a fiber product from Mexico, led to agricultural development in the American Great Plains and in Canada. because of wheat production using this kind of an implement called a binder, needed binder twine to tie those wheat shocks together. And so that was the best fiber, came from Mexico to make that, and from the Yucatan Peninsula, which then again tied these kind of areas together in an interesting way. But the Philippines competed, and I want to talk about that a little bit now because it's one of my more newer research areas. In the Philippines, they grow a crop called abaca. I'm not sure if that's familiar to most of you in the room or not. It's sometimes called Manila hemp, okay? Although it's nothing like hemp at all. It grows on this tree, which is called the Musa textilis, obviously not. Those of you know bananas. Bananas are Musa sapientis, the wisdom muse, the muses of the wisdom, right? Very similar. In fact, that looks like a banana plant to me, except it doesn't really produce edible fruit. Can't eat the fruit. But on those stems, it produces fiber, the very best fiber in the world, far better than Yucatec and Henneken, except it's so far away, it made it more expensive to come in. And so for a while, the abaca fiber was also used for binder twine and various ropes and things like that. Most naval rope in the world is made from this, the very best naval rope in the world was. And so it reminds me of how the Philippines is connected in the world in a very important way. But that connection goes way back to the Manila Galleon from 1565 to 1815. And in those years, this galleon that went twice a year round from Manila to Acapulco, bringing all the trade products from the Orient to Mexico and then later to Spain and across the world in these kind of ships, whose sails, by the way, were made with abaca fiber from the Philippines. Connecting the Philippines in this way for all those years to the Orient as well as to Europe. But within, we can maybe see that as kind of a way of understanding the importance of abaca to the American West and other places in this region too. Because it was abaca fiber used in the ropes that created the San Francisco Bay Bridge. It was abaca fiber that was used in the construction for the Hoover Dam and all the ropes and things needed there. There's a million connections between the two regions based on this one kind of commodity flow. And so there we have the Manila Galleon kind of transposed against this newer product. And today, while Henneken in Mexico went down, abaca producers in the Philippines have developed all kinds of alternative products that have given a great economic boost to Filipinos in their own country. Ropes and twines, patio furniture, upholstery material, all the kind of things used for car seats, buses, airlines. Important component for recyclable ELV fiberglass, interior materials, home decorations, hammocks, carpets, rugs, mats, building materials, all these kind of things. Specialty paper products like cigarette paper. If you roll your own, think about now how it's coming from abaca from the Philippines. All those kind of things. Might be kind of interesting. But the number one product now using abaca is coffee filters. And so German coffee filters have now made all kinds of interesting contracts using only Philippine abaca because it's the best kind of filter paper available. So it's kind of interesting to see how these small kind of commodities are important, especially for places like the Philippines, because now with the I think it's 11% of Filipinos work abroad and send remittances home, like so many other places in the world. This is maybe giving an opportunity where agriculture can really help. A local commodity can help stimulate the economy back in the Philippines. But because it's so much like bananas, producers thought, well, wherever bananas grow, like Central America, we can also grow abaca. And so now they transplanted that material there and are kind of competing with the Philippines themselves. It would be closer to export to Europe and North America. Ecuador now grows abaca too because it's a banana producing region. So it's kind of interesting to see how that can be followed. But boy, talk about demand to conserve and protect the environment. Abaca is, again, one of those plants that we can look at and say there's not always agricultural decline. There's many successes between the two fields of environmental science and agriculture. For biodiversity preservation when intercropped with coconut palms. It prevents erosion, aids in preserving water and preventing floods and landslides. There's less depletion of soil nutrients. Abaca paper can be recycled several times more than paper from wood pulp or other sources. Abaca waste leaves little physical and chemical residue, and there's less energy consumed in creating abaca products. Get on the abaca bandwagon, folks. This is a great product, and the Filipinos are leading the way for it and kind of spreading out and across the entire world from this one fiber product. But let's talk about other connections too, maybe with Latin America, since we're on that subject, and with Asia, maybe specifically first. Cecilia Sue's book, Garden of the World, Asian Immigrants and the Making of Agriculture in California's Santa Cruz Valley. What an important book that is to talk about the labor coming from Asia, Chinese and other Asian workers who came, and agriculture would not have been successful in the Central Valley without it. Or Greg Cushman's book, Guano and the Opening of the Pacific World, A Global Ecological History. Guano, the #1 fertilizer in the world that came from off the coast of Peru, that agriculture in Europe had declined so rapidly before the invention of chemical phosphates, that guano, literally bat shit and seabird shit from the coast off of Peru, led to the largest increase of agricultural production in the world. And later American farmers were starting to use it too, and it put Peru on the map for a while, until that was also a depleted resource. This interesting book, Edward Del Malillo's book, Stranger on Familiar Soil, not the best cover here, gray with yellow. Come on, yellow, what are you thinking of here? But nonetheless, an amazing book that looks at the connections between Chile and California. Not only the two long coasts on the Pacific side, not only the two have similar ecological regions that are kind of north and south, but how Chileans introduced alfalfa and wheat to California during the gold rush days. How California introduced vineyards and fruits to Chile. How workers came from both places. And in this book, it's an amazing transnational history for agriculture and environment between one region and another that looks at those in important ways. So the good things are happening out there in agricultural history. Talking of Latin America too, one of my areas that I'm researching now is the transnational Colombian sugar industry. I'm very excited about this, and I think my friend Tim Lorick, who just walked in too, and I have the same experience about how the area in red there is the Cauca Valley of southern Colombia. And the first time you fly into Cali, Colombia, you're surrounded by nothing but sugarcane. And it's an amazing experience. My first time there, I was like, can there be this much sugarcane here? Because when we think of Colombia, we think of cocaine, we think of coffee, Juan Valdez, Pablo Escobar, right? But we should also think of other things that are making Colombia a self-sufficient country, like the development of their sugar industry, cane. So it's like 3 canes, right? The 3 C's, coca, coffee, and cane are important for this industry. And so I started investigating more about this interesting sugar industry there in Cali, Colombia, in the Valle del Cauca, and how the nodes are planted, not the seeds, and off the nodes sprout the cane. And talk about transnational. This kind of falls into my lap, these interesting stories that I find very fascinating. Because this guy, the visionary fundador, the founder of the Colombian sugarcane industry, was this man, Don Santiago Eder, okay, James Eder, who was a Prussian immigrant, a German, who went to kind of just look at Colombia, found out that they're not using this valley for all of the potential that it could have. I bet it could grow sugarcane. He starts to do that. And then kind of all kinds of other connections that he has with industrialists all over Europe, all over the United States, with family members still in Europe and some family in the United States, develops a sugar industry almost single-handedly by this one family and the investments that they were able to do. To the beautiful chapel on the campus of the sugar mill there. But it really is quite industrial today, although it hires an incredible number of local people, and it's a great local source of economy, and it's helping Colombia be more sustainable in their own production of foods. But the kind of big 5-trailer trucks that roam up and down the sugar fields bringing cane to the mill. And it is rather a large process now. But in terms of how he developed railroads to bring those products from the port of Buenaventura to the valley of the Cauca Valley. And how then the big scare by the end of the 19th century was there's going to be sugar beet development in Germany and in the United States, and there was, that was going to impact this. And so the transnational competition between beets and sugarcane was affecting how local people in Colombia were starting to have their agricultural advancement. But it has become big industry now, and there are 13 large sugar mills in southern Colombia here, and how it's moved into that, a big, no longer a family venture, of course, but the big industrial ag. Which brings up what I want to talk about next. I want to talk about this as a concern and a trend in this age of agricultural ignorance. Agriculture versus agri-industry. Jim Hightower once again talks about how agri-industry is the conglomerized, Wall Streetized, monopolized, globalized, chemicalized, and plasticized model of treating dinner as just another manufactured product is presently dominant. And of course, we see that with big industry and ag today as it's come. But perhaps as historians, we know that's nothing really quite new. By the end of the 19th and early 20th century, Liberty Hyde Bailey at Cornell, an agronomist at Cornell University, was talking about it and warned about the harmful effects of industrial capitalism on farming, and started the whole Country Life Commission, which many people have written about. And I think there's echoes of that today that we could learn from. There are new Liberty Hyde Baileys. For example, philosopher and farmer, Kentucky farmer Wendell Berry, has talked about eating is profound. It's a profound political act. It lets us vote for the industrial model or choose to go back to the future of agriculture, which he defines as the art and science of cooperating with, rather than overwhelming, nature. So if there's good news about this today, there's certainly agri-industry that's taking over the field, but there's still agriculture very present. For example, farming and ag production. 80% of the world's food still comes from family farms, and we need to kind of keep that in mind, okay, that 80% still does come from family farms. And as Hightower has written about that, though, but they're under considerable high debt for machinery and low prices. And as he talks about here, how the financial trusts and hedge fund hucksters are buying up farms and converting them into fast buck investment packages all over the United States. In fact, one that's even nicely called American Farmland Company is actually a huge syndicate of New York City's largest real estate empire, a wealth management outfit, and 2 Florida sugar barons, and is a subsidiary of Prudential Financial. And that's kind of the way this big ag is going across the states today. So, but really, 65% of the world's agricultural lands are still controlled by a small group of investors. And so therefore, we see that the family farm is being swallowed up by these agriculture investors, and those farmers are becoming then wage workers for the large firms. Take water, for instance, okay, industrialized water, and how the family farmer can't really deal with this. But just look at what water is, how much water it takes for even individual crops. 1 almond, 1 gallon of water. I thought about that, eating almonds on Delta Airlines yesterday. 1 walnut, 5 gallons. 1 head of lettuce, 12 gallons of water to produce a head of lettuce. 1 cluster of grapes, 24 gallons. 1 egg, 53 gallons. 1 pound of chicken, 468 gallons of water. 1 gallon of milk makes from 880 gallons of water. And 1 pound of beef, 1,800 gallons of water per pound of beef. That takes corporate entity. That requires all kinds of strain. And that's actually from an article in the National Geographic, The Hidden Water We Use, trying to reach out to a wider audience to understand how that can work. So the big company, there's incredible industrial water pollution that goes on with this industrial water for ag. For example, oil companies like ExxonMobil in California are selling fracking wastewater to ag producers in the Central Valley. Not a great component. And runoff from ag lands in the lower 48 states, and that's 330 million acres of farmland, is the largest water polluter in public waters. Ag is the largest polluter of public waters, not industry, okay? Especially of rivers. The EPA estimates that in 165,000 miles of rivers, 64% of the pollution was from ag, okay? Compared to resource extraction was only 9% from like mining. Yet the EPA provides very little agriculture on ag runoff. So it's interesting how that works and is part of this corporate system. But as Wendell Berry talks about then, there is kind of a good food uprising going on in the United States that we should just write about as much as the fear of industrial ag, okay? And he writes how the fastest growing segment of the food economy is creating the alternative model of local, sustainable, small scale, community-based, organic, humane, healthy, democratic, and tasty food system for all. There is this big movement going on in the United States. In fact, it's a coalition built of family farmers, consumer groups, environmental groups, labor groups, and even church groups are involved in this kind of new good food movement going on. I'm proud that in Oklahoma, we turned down a bill that would have dealt with that very issue. It was called the Right to Farm Bill. Some people called it the Right to Harm Bill, in which Big Ag wanted to say no more legislation. We should just be able to have carte blanche to come into Oklahoma and do what we want with ag. And the voters actually turned that down, which was maybe surprising in a conservative, pretty red state. And I'm also proud that we're kind of having a reverse Okie effect. We have a lot of ag land left in Oklahoma, and we're inviting Californians to come back, kind of in a reverse Okie pattern, to come back to Oklahoma and farm there, where it's a lot cheaper to farm than it is in California. And so it's kind of interesting how these kind of trends develop. But then let's talk about organic farming. That's a trend that's part of this new good food movement, right? By last year in the United States, it was up 6% from the previous year, an increase of nearly 15,000 organically certified farms. That's good news for those of you who are interested in that. Sales were up by 11%, or worth $43.3 billion a year, up 4 times from the more conventional food sales. An interesting trend. GMO, genetically modified, is down. Farmers cut planting of GMO crops by 5.4 million acres, and sales of GMO seeds fell by $400 million, despite the efforts put out by Monsanto and the big GMO corporations. And local initiatives are banning it, like in Hawaii, there was a successful initiative to ban GMO foods there. So it's interesting what's going on. Part of this new then is part of what Consumer Reports even reported that American food shoppers want: to support local farmers, 91%, to reduce exposure to pesticides in food, 89%, to protect the environment from chemicals, a high 88%, and to provide better conditions for livestock. There's good reason for that, is there not? Let's talk about livestock, right? Let's go to cattle first, okay? Grazing actually is the most widespread agricultural practice in the world. That's what uses up more ag land than anything else in the entire world, grazing for cattle. And it's also one of the most ecologically destructive agricultural practices, especially in arid regions where they do a lot of cattle grazing. This is sometimes called the bovine curtain in the American West. I like how different people label curtains. You remember the Iron Curtain that fell right over Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. They talk about the bamboo curtain in what was formerly Red China. There's the tortilla curtain that separates the United States from Latin America. Now, with maybe going to be a big wall at the tortilla curtain, I'm not sure. We already have 700 miles of wall that was there from the Bush years, okay? And there's the big piney curtain in East Texas. There's the Zion curtain in Utah. And now we're talking about the bovine curtain in the American West, where ranchers use federal lands, BLM and Forest Service lands, to graze their cattle for much reduced rates, including in an AUM system, an animal unit month, okay, which is what a 5 sheep or a cow and her calf can sustain on 1 unit of land for a month, is the formula that the government came up with for these ranchers in the West. That's great, except that you taxpayers are subsidizing one industry over another. Maybe that's okay. Maybe we're okay with subsidizing that because it's a way of life. Maybe because it's not urbanized yet, or maybe we're keeping those BLM lands safe, the wide open rangelands that we consider what the American West is. But nonetheless, it comes at a price, because even more money can be made on those lands with outfitting and hunting and fishing and nature preservation and things, and all kinds of studies have been made about that. And except the bovine curtain has also produced a lot of bad environmental practices, like the introduction of cheatgrass and other non-native species that take over in regular rangeland. Fires are way up, and erosion is way up on these grazing lands, and so it comes at a considerable price. And I'm not sure the ranchers would be able to afford to work those lands if it were not for those kind of government interventions that taxpayers support. So notice this map that shows the rangeland, percent of pasture and rangelands that are in poor or very poor condition. You're lucky here in Mississippi, only 1%. More rainfall maybe, better practices, maybe not as much wide open land. But nonetheless, out in the American West, the rangelands are pretty bad. Notice the high percentages of poor rangeland or very poor conditions throughout the West. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Again, this is nothing new though, right? President Franklin Roosevelt, during the New Deal years, went out and was surveying some of these Western lands and said, the nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. And that's why some of his New Dealers, like Rexford Tugwell and others, believed in a permanent agriculture, right? and a permanent country, as they called it too, because erosion was so horrible during those years. And it's funny about that time period too, because Hugh Bennett, who was the head of the Soil Conservation Service at the time, talked about friends of the land and how all these things kind of go together: soil, grass, trees, songbirds, game, flowers, livestock, landscape, and outdoor recreation would merge together into kind of the friends of the land, almost hearkening back to the country life model that Liberty High Bailey talked about even earlier. It's funny how not all the presidents, but when President Roosevelt was visiting the site of a dam in the American West, he even said, "It is an error to say that we have conquered nature. We must rather shape our lives in a more harmonious relationship with nature." I'm not sure how many other New Deal policies maybe reflected that, but it's interesting that a president would say that. Not a whole lot of presidents really have, if you think about that. Maybe him and his cousin Teddy Roosevelt from way back. Notice JFK, when he visited the Garrison Diversion Project in North Dakota, President Kennedy mentioned, "Man improves what nature has done." Now that's an interesting change from the FDR days. Or go up to the time of President Nixon, who certainly some people even called the environmental president, with the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the organization of NEPA, the EPA, etc. But his Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, known for his policy of we must farm from fence row to fence row, right? Put a lot of things into production, said, "There are more important things than the environment." So different changes across time and how some of those maybe agricultural policies have been gone over time. But there's hope. How many people have heard of Alan Savory and holistic range management or holistic resource management? Not very many people have. And yet here is one individual who has made such an important change in the history of ag. And again, if we want to deal with our theme today, transnational connections. Let me say a few words about this guy who was from the 1980s, a Rhodesian, today Zimbabwean, wildlife biologist and farmer. Alan Savory moved to the United States, observed the sorry state of many pastures and fields in the Great Plains and American West, caused by mismanaged cattle ranching, and via his Center for Holistic Resource Management in Albuquerque, New Mexico, now called the Savory Institute, advocated that the experience of ungulate grazing in Africa could heal and restore American grasslands. By 1984, his concepts of planned grazing and holistic management were gaining endorsement and adoption by ranchers throughout the West, especially as Savory's ideas called for increased, not less, grazing, okay, which is interesting. But he argued that cattle herds should be managed so as to encourage more intensive grazing. Get more cowboys out there, move the cattle more, okay, which would then imitate the ungulates of Africa's savannas and grasslands where hoof action for mulching and ample manuring led to restored and ecologically vibrant pastures. For North America, this was in the same vein that the vast herds of bison had represented for grazing. Intensive hoof mulching, moving those cattle around like the bison used to do, would make the prairie vital in the Great Plains. Thus, cattle had to graze intensively in one area and be moved to other fields often, which means more labor, which means probably higher prices, to keep the cycle alive. The process was holistic, as it included not only research and adaptations for local environmental conditions, but also the voices of local communities, cultures, and economies, as the system has worked in Africa for generations. Savory's theories, proven successful over and over by thousands of ranchers, reflect rural connections to a broader world in which lessons and ideals from elsewhere have led to improved agricultural production and environmental health in rural America. We need to take the lead from people like Alan Savory, who are working on these kinds of issues in a big way. And notice the areas of the world where ranching is still predominant, grazing of cattle is still predominant. That's why this kind of lesson, maybe it's not the right ecology, but since we still eat beef, and since it's such a part of cultures in so many parts of the world, as this map shows in red, we ought to look at ways of Alan Savory talk about for holistic range management. How about hogs? You want to talk about hogs? They're now raised in these horrible CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. Confined animal feeding operations, which are mechanical sow birthing operations in gestation crates. So in other words, here's how it works. A sow, throughout pregnancy, are immobilized, jammed into row after row of 2-foot wide gestation crates until they deliver their litter of 7 to 10 little piglets or whatever. And 9 out of 10 sows in America spend their lives in this kind of industrial hell. And there's very loose and lax regulations or enforcement to try to prevent that from becoming worse. It's even worse when natural disasters strike, like when the hurricanes hit North Carolina, and some of the big hog and poultry operations there had created bloated carcasses of drowned and decaying hogs and millions of dead chickens all over the place in coastal North Carolina. And at least 15 enormous waste lagoons spewing forth the waste into the natural environment happened because of the loose regulations. You might think that it's probably maybe worse other places. China has very high regulations of swine production, and yet they found it cheaper to support the North Carolina hogs and import it back to China so they wouldn't get around the loose regulations. So it's one thing that maybe that kind of livestock production needs to work on, including the incredible waste lagoons there. How about poultry? Big part of the country, the American South, here in poultry production, especially Arkansas, North Carolina, Alabama, Virginia. Americans consume 77 billion eggs a year, interesting number. That often come from hellish, windowless egg factories. But there's good news. Activists had success when $6 billion Purdue farms, producing 676 million chickens a year, the 4th largest U.S. poultry producer, discovered that improving conditions reduced cost. And isn't that what it's going to take? That better conditions made better sales and reduced production costs. And so that actually is great news. And others are starting to take, activists are actually getting a lot of success in this field too. California voters passed a ballot initiative banning battery cage confinement for chickens. And after that, the society's organizers convinced Burger King to adopt a cage-free policy. McDonald's, IHOP, Kroger, Major, Costco, and Trader Joe's all followed suit. And finally, even the largest egg seller in America, Walmart, actually then also went to 100% cage-free egg supply, at least down the road. So it's interesting that it's bad news, but there are things that are changing fast in the industry. What about seafood? Let's talk about this for a second. Talk about transnational. Wow. 90% of the seafood in America comes from abroad and coming from an average distance of almost 6,000 miles away, an average distance of 5,475 miles away. Shrimp is the most consumed seafood in America, but despite the abundance in U.S. waters, we import 94% from abroad, from an average of 8,000 miles away to eat shrimp. You like shrimp and grits? You might think about where it's coming from. The U.S. government conducts food safety inspections on less than 2% of this imported product and only on 0.7% in 2014. So what's interesting about that, where is it coming from? Vietnam, where there's high bacteria contamination rates, 58%. Ecuador, 61% contaminated bacteria import rates. Indonesia, 69%. India, 74%. And a whopping 83% from imported shrimp from Bangladesh. We need to think about those kind of things and work for policy protection measures. What about the plight of agricultural and food workers? We need to keep them in mind as well, not just the food. There are extreme poverty in places like the California Central Valley. And as historians, we remind ourselves of things like the Grapes of Wrath and labor conditions, or the famous Harvest of Shame documentary that came out in the 1960s about the plight of African American workers in the Deep South. And yet, it's not all that much better today. The homelessness rate in Central California for agricultural workers is incredibly high, and a lack of schools for kids. In fact, the low pay is really amazing that and in the fast food industry itself, in the fast food market, it's not just agricultural workers, but in the food production system there, the employers make about $300 a week. And of course with no benefits, things that we should probably keep in mind. In fact, all kinds of no-hire agreements that prohibit one franchise from hiring another if they're fired. and secret bans on wage competition. And 70,000 food chain restaurants signed into these kind of low wage competition bans, including McDonald's, Burger King, Carl's Jr.'s, Domino's, Pizza Hut, and others. So it's something that I think we should think about, not just the food production, but also the kind of workers involved in those kind of places. And finally, maybe let me say a word about wasted foods and wastelands. What an interesting development this has been in the last few years. That now it is known that 40 to 50% of all American food is thrown away. We're not the highest on that. South Korea is. South Korea probably has an almost 70 to 80% throwaway rate of food in their country. But this is something that we need to know about. Wasted food. 40 to 50% of American food. Vast quantities of fresh produce are left in the fields to rot, fed to livestock, so maybe not completely wasted, or hauled to landfills. Globally, 1.6 billion tons of food valued at $1 a ton is wasted a year. In a place where we have also starvation and hunger going on in rapidly places. And maybe you've heard of agricultural dumping. This is a process that is also, I think, should be the subject for papers and dissertations and books to come, where ag products abroad are sold at below market prices to dump them off the US market. It's often done in humanitarian ways. Go to Haiti, and the humanitarian groups that go to Haiti, and all kinds of agricultural producers dump food onto Haiti, maybe to make them feel good, I'm not sure. But then the Haitians can't distribute it, there's no way to preserve it, it rots in Haiti when it should be distributed to starving people there. Ag dumping should be on our radars. We're not going to have any food, folks, though, if we don't keep bees. And there is something now going on that should also be, we're very aware of, and that is CCD, colony collapse disorder, okay? Whereas in 2014, US beekeepers lost 40% of their pollinating bees. I hope most of you know beekeepers are so essential to agricultural production. They go up and down fields with their beehives on their trucks to release bees to pollinate. We're still dependent on that old-fashioned system of pollination, and so we have to have bees. But field conversion due to industrial ag and pesticide abuse, especially Dow Chemical sulfoxaflor, which is also protected by the EPA, has destroyed these kind of bees in a big way. The U.S. could lose $15 billion a year, according to some studies, if this trend continues, let alone reduction in food and nutrition diversity. Notice here this chart how it shows from 6 million hives in 1947 down to 2.5 million hives by 2008, and the number keeps going down. There's a huge, in fact, there's even such demand for beehives as there's actually bee theft going on. There was a big one in Iowa recently where 15,000 beehives were stolen. Kind of like we used to do cattle rustling, now it's beehive rustling across the United States. These 7 crops would be totally disappear without bees. Pumpkins, peaches, watermelons, berries, avocados, almonds, cotton. Cotton. Think about the impact of cotton here in Mississippi. You have to have bees. Have to have that bee pollination going on. And many, many others, as this chart shows. The northern tier of states, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan are now the #1 beehive states, the #1 honey producing states. I believe North Dakota, we think of as wheat country, my home state, is actually the #1 honey producing state right now. And so there is hope that these kind of states will keep the beehive tradition going on, but all these other products are related to it. But maybe there's hope. If food production runs out, there's something called GVR. Has anybody heard of GVR? That is gastronomic virtual reality. Founded by Jinzu An, GVR is a simulated dining experience, a food future without actual food. Rather, nutrients would come from low-cal substances like agar, konjac jelly, and gum arabic that An calls Project Nourished. He promises GVR would create a complete sensory experience with virtual reality headsets, aromatic diffusers, and cutlery with sensors that will fool our brains into thinking we're eating steak, lasagna, pie, and other real foods. Form a line if you want GVR. Maybe we should be, who knows about the future, right? We'll have to be looking into these kind of things if food production is down. And the gravity well also is kind of on the horizon for also looking at new ways of providing food technologies. the gravity well, how Earth is at the bottom of this gravity well that stretches 1 million miles into space, and how the technology being developed by NASA scientists and space engineers to sustain life for explorations into the gravity well, and with possible applications food tech back here on Earth, is maybe kind of an interesting development in some ways, right? It's already been used for home craft and for the craft brew industry. For example, the CO2 craft brewery recovery system is based on technologies created to harvest and liquefy and store the gas on Mars, which makes it more economical for microbreweries to put the billions, to save billions, to put the bubbles in beer. So it's kind of interesting how maybe these future technologies might be somewhat useful in some ways, maybe a bit more than GVR. But still, they're still regular food. This is what still supplies most people. This was in the paper recently, that 20% of the world still just has rice and water. That is their food source. 60% rice, beans, and water. And 20% of us, the rest of us, who enjoy kind of a lavish meal. Think about that. Still in today. And also, if you go one step further, we're in the vast minority that eat with utensils. Number 2 is chopsticks, and number 1 is still with your hands. Most people in the world eat with their hands, then chopsticks, then utensils, these kind of meals. So food is still obviously going to be rather important as a thing that we have to think about. There's hope. How many have heard of the USDA Food Access Atlas? Those of you who are teachers, those of you going into teaching maybe, this is something that will be a great tool for all of you to have. And I'm proud that the Ag History Society still has great connections with the USDA. We're going to be celebrating those even more in our 100th anniversary next year in Washington, D.C. But the USDA has come up with a Food Desert Atlas, the Food Security Atlas, and the Food and Health Atlases. And the website is there. You might want to check it out sometime. All kinds of great maps are there of food deserts. And now, like this map shows how far it is from places to a local store or where food is grown, actually. And obviously, those are places. It shows you how to use it and detailed explanations of food access indicators. You can click on any county in America. Just click on your county sometime and see what it's like for the food desert or the food access procedures in your county. Especially areas like this that show larger areas of poverty. This is more of a poverty map here showing the decline of health relations and food. And obviously those are bigger out west where there's American Indian reservations and less food access and less food sovereignty and less and more dependence on food from other areas from their own local region. This map also shows it in a more interesting way too, food insecurity rates, okay? Notice North Dakota is one of the best there, and some of the places on the East Coast are the most food secure places. But again, showing some of the places, the darker colored blotches on the map there, parts of the Deep South, including still the Delta, the Mississippi, right? The big Indian reservation areas of the American West, like northern Arizona and western South Dakota, are still the most food insecure places here in the United States. And I'm very pleased that the educational resources like this are available through the USDA. This map's interesting. No car and no supermarket store within a mile, areas across the country. It's useful resources for students to help you think about how we could develop, how at least to think about in our own country, the idea of food security or food sovereignty, which is maybe even a better term used today. And all kinds of other things too. Low-income households, even like this one map shows here, obesity rates across the country, which are another indication of health and food security in many ways and diversity of diet. And that's only being made worse, folks, by NAFTA. Places like Mexico now are suffering incredible obesity rates never seen before in the history of Mexico because of the free trade allowing all kinds of fast foods and junk foods into the Mexican food stream. And so those are kind of interesting developments and trends and maybe concerns that I have as we talk about the age of agricultural ignorance and how we can fight that kind of age of agricultural ignorance as we proceed on into this century that we're in. Thank you.
I think you'd be happy to answer a few questions.
Do we have any theories about, or credible theories about the decline in the bee population?
Yeah, a lot of it is because of pesticide abuse, okay? Again, environmental change is another big reason too for that. I mean, obviously we're still feeding this many people in the world. We're not down there, but it's a concern. Agronomists are very, very concerned about this decline of bees. And it just kind of makes us think how most of us probably don't know where that's still dependent on bee pollination for food production, and how the importance of beekeepers are, apiaries and things. And so, mainly though, environmental conditions and pesticide. Joe?
Thanks for the presentation. One of the things I like about what you did, and I think might be a direction to go in the future, is maybe some of those connections about the cost of this kind of ignorance, right? So some of the things about the real take-homes for human health, right? About the drinking water, about the obesity, the food deserts, things like that. I'm just wondering if you could riff a little bit on, you know, what tomorrow is, given the prevalence of this agricultural ignorance. I know historians are terrible with tomorrow, but maybe that might be something you could suggest by way of a conclusion for us here.
It's not going to be GVR. Okay, that's not the future. Interesting ideas. Tomorrow is going to be, hopefully, some of the trends that are on the uprise. The change in poultry industry, the change in organic, the change in more local produced foods. And I know that comes at a cost. Some of those are more expensive, and I'm the first to admit to that. And yet, it can be brought down. I think some of the future things, too, that we're going to be looking for are maybe changes, especially if we look at grazing. That's going to have to change, probably, in the American West. It's not sustainable the way it is now, although it continues, and there's interesting ways of their plans for grazing in the West and things. I think in terms of the food deserts and things like that going on, I think these kind of maps and the things that the USDA are bringing to our attention help us be more aware of that, and maybe can help us focus on policy. And yet, maybe that's where I'm the most concerned. The policy is what's also short-shrifted. Doesn't have much. We don't hear much in the Trump administration about food or agricultural policy. We didn't under Obama either, okay? And again, what do we know about our Secretary of Agriculture, usually from a southern or a western state or a midwestern state, and things. Other trends like that, I'm not really sure. Again, the crystal ball is not in front of me. But I think trends are actually good. I'm not here just to give a declensionist speech this afternoon. I'm actually pleased in the way some things are really, that activists are working on that, and you still can fight some of these kind of conditions, and we can still vote with our dollar and things like that. Although not a lot of people have access to do that, especially in the more food insecure parts of the map. But that's a good question, Joe. And hopefully these can maybe, as in the next 50 or 60 years that you'll be involved with this organization, we'll be discussing some of these things at conferences and in articles and whatnot. Please.
When you were saying grazing was destructive, were you meaning like when ranchers let them eat the grass too low?
Yeah, overgrazing. That's one area. Okay, overgrazing. So then you have a bare pasture. And then the winds come and bring in all kinds of things that aren't really natural from there, and the natural plants can't compete, okay? And plus sometimes they're fed from other things when they're not grazing, and so then they defecate in those fields, obviously bringing in other kinds of plants that are not endemic, or not native to that region. And so mainly overgrazing is the big concern, though. And the BLM and the Forest Service have plans. I used to be on BLM committees for that when I lived in Wyoming, and to look at what kind of resources should be involved? What kind of grazing numbers should we allow for this one area and things like that? And it's going to depend on, and they always over-allow because they're going to go with the ranching side of that. But then I eat beef too. I'm not a vegetarian yet. Probably won't be in my next life either, to tell you the truth. But so I'm part of the problem, right? But nonetheless. Other beef-producing states, like Mississippi, is actually one of the biggest beef-producing states. Maybe a lot of you knew that. It's not so much ranch land grazing like that in public lands, but it's more feedlot and things like that. But nonetheless, there might be other ways of beef production without the kind of overgrazing. Limiting numbers, but again, that's all subsidized, and the ranchers scream bloody murder if you want to start limiting numbers, because that's their way of life. It was their homestead way back, and so it becomes kind of a cultural issue in a big way. Yeah, good question. Please.
So you talk a lot about trends and just agricultural history in general. And you really highlighted a lot of the transnational, this transnational trend. Do you think this is where agricultural history is going?
It's where I'm going. It's where many people are going. I just showed some of my favorite books that are kind of part of this trend. And I don't think other trends should be ignored. We should still be doing a lot on gender, race, and class of U.S. rural life and all those kind of things. That's why I like this organization. That's why I like this discipline so much, to tell you the truth. My interest maybe do extend more transnationally because I see so many connections to local places like what cotton was, like what sugar has been. Sugar, gosh, starts in originally from India, goes to the Arabian Peninsula, goes to Africa, goes to the Middle East. Then by the 1550s starts going to like the Madeiras and Canary Islands and eventually to the Caribbean and Brazil. What a transnational commodity that is for something that's not essential to life, right? And think of the same for coffee and tobacco and all kinds of things like that too. I'm not sure it should be the only, it should not be the only trend. It's a trend I'm interested in, and I'm saying it's a trend that's developed probably in the last 10 years or so, and there's some great research out there that's showing these kind of connections. And usually those kind of connections boil down to a commodity or to some kind of trade or agricultural development, and I find that kind of fascinating myself, and I think it shows all kinds of how we are connected to lots of other regions. But yeah, good question. Please, sir.
You mentioned the thing about the shrimp.
Okay.
Why do you think that is, especially when it's such an easy to find thing in this area?
Well, because it's cheaper abroad. Cheaper labor, cheaper production. We get into that kind of situation. And a lot of it's farm shrimp, obviously, and that's whatever. It still tastes good or whatever you like shrimp. I like shrimp. But the point of the matter is I just wish it would be more tested. I wish there would be more application because there's going to be a lot of diseases that could be spawned by that. I'm not sure we see that in the news very much, but that it's known to us that low percentage of shrimp are inspected is kind of mind-boggling, really, right? And yet it's such an influx, it's such a huge industry. It might be hard to, I'm sure it's only random or spot tested or things like that, but nonetheless, that's probably the reason. Yeah, good. Please.
So I'm just curious, back to the bee topic.
Okay.
What kind of ideology, makes you believe that if they weren't present? Because, I've taken an entomology class.
Okay.
My professor did say, he was like, bees weren't here. We brought them over. So
What kind of bee was not here?
He just said bees.
Apis mellifera was not here.
Yeah.
Okay. Other bees were endemic. Bees are always everywhere. There are invasive kinds of bees that have come from Europe, okay? And so like bumblebees or others, African killer bees are certainly not from here. But other insects, there's native bees that have pollinated plants here forever. And other insects pollinate too, not just bees. But bees are used by hive collectors, the apiists, that go up and down the fields with their hives. And so that's probably the better of the pollinators, but all kinds of insects pollinate. That's a really good point. I should have mentioned. Thank you for bringing that up. I should mention that in another time. But bees are the most useful. Not all bees are native to the United States. That's very true.
I just remember him going on it.
Good memory. Is that professor here? He'd be very glad that you remembered that. Good for him and good for you for remembering. Okay, we'll go enjoy dinner tonight later.